Hello, Giants fans, and welcome to an evening edition of the Valentine's Views podcast here on YouTube. We are doing this live stream, the post week 18 live stream. We're doing this on Sunday evening because tomorrow morning will be the final day of access to players and maybe general manager Joe Schoen if the Giants do decide to keep him. We might get to speak to him tomorrow, and I will be I'll be at the facility all morning. So Tony DelGenio and I are doing this now, and as I said to Tony before we started, a couple of old guys who probably at this hour would rather have their feet up and just hanging out watching some TV, but we're here to talk New York Giants for you guys, so let's do that. And Tony, of course, the Giants, as we know, the Giants are going to giant, and they of course did that the last 2 weeks of this year, going from winning 2 games, going from having control of the draft with the number 1 pick to ending up with the number 5 pick. And I never get mad about winning, but in the end, it does make you shake your head because they did this in 2019, 2020, 2023, and 2024. They won games at the end of lost seasons that cost themselves draft position. And the only thing I can say is what I said at the top is the Giants are going to giant no matter what we want them to do.
Yeah, it's just the way it is. And I guess, would Las Vegas have won that game if the Giants had lost their game, or would they have found a way to manage to lose it and keep that number 1 pick? We'll never know. But obviously, the Giants winning gave Las Vegas the freedom to play the game that they wanted to play, right? And from the players' standpoint, players are never thinking about draft position; they just want to win games. And so, for the Giants players that I feel played their butts off this season, good for them to get another win at the end of the year and go out on a positive note instead of a negative note.
Yeah, I in that respect, I felt good for Tyrone Tracy, who had a big day, his best day of the season. And I think the Giants probably gave him the ball a few extra times, knowing, that he was close to, it's not 1,000-yard rushing season, but it's 1,000-yard total yards from scrimmage season, which gives him, back-to-back seasons of 1,000 yards from scrimmage, the first 2 years of his career. And that's nice. And he's a good player. And again, this year he did that, where he was really overshadowed the beginning of the season, didn't play much, didn't get the ball much. Nice day for Gunnar Olszewski, his first 100-yard receiving game, far and away the biggest game of his 6 or 7 year NFL career. I felt good for Mike Kafka, to be honest with you, getting another win. He doesn't know what's going to happen. He probably understands that he's a long shot to get the Giants head coaching job, but he gets another win before, whatever's going to happen here, whether he's back with the Giants in some capacity, whether he's somewhere else. He said after the game, he had a lot of family and friends at the game last night. So I felt good for him, but again, 2 weeks ago, it looked like the Giants would control the draft, have the number 1 pick, be able to get, a haul of draft picks. And now that's no longer the case because they're not getting a haul for number 5. They're probably going to wind up, having to, as they say, stick and pick at number 5.
Yeah, I think that's the likelihood. I felt good for some of the Giants players that you mentioned Tyrone Tracy, and he's really been under the radar this year. First because of Cam Scatterbo, and second because so much of the attention on the offense went to to Jackson Dart. But actually, if you look at Tyra, and this isn't the day to do it because he fumbled today, so it's a bad time to bring this up. But in addition to him hitting 1,000 yards for the second time in 2 seasons, actually, if you compare his stats from his rookie season to this season, I was kind of uncomfortable with him last season because he coughed the ball up so much, and he went from, I think, 4 fumbles last year to 1 fumble this year, and it happened to be today. And he went from 6 drop passes, which is one of the other things that drove me crazy about him. And of course, he started out as a wide receiver, and his coach in college turned him into a running back because he didn't think it was a good enough wide receiver to get drafted. And
which he wasn't.
and he went from, which he wasn't. And he went from, I think, 6 drop passes last year to 2 drop passes this year. And so, if you want to take the longer view of things, having Scadaboo, 4th-round draft pick, and Tracy, a 5th-round draft pick, as your running back tandem going into 2026, that's looking pretty good. Neither of them is a threat, I think, to be an all-pro or anything like that. But if you add a real run grading interior offensive lineman to that OL during the offseason, the Giants could have one of the better running attacks in the NFL next season. And I think Tyrone Tracy has really established himself as a quality NFL running back. And he caught a bunch of passes in a TD too.
Yeah, and it's one of those. It's funny because I asked him earlier in the season about whether it was an adjustment, catching passes as a running back, and he said that it wasn't. But I think his play on the field and his performance this year might say something different. But I do feel good for Tracy. I do think he's a good running back. I think that we'll talk more about Joe Schoen in a little while, of course, but I think that in his mind, this is the running back room that Joe Schoen wanted, or the type of running back room he wanted when he moved on from Saquon Barkley. An inexpensive running back room with younger, productive players who aren't necessarily the superstars, but I do think this is the kind of room that he wanted. Tony, I do want to talk about the Giants sitting at number 5. Okay, and for me, here's the consolation of number 5. I think the Giants weren't going to pick at number 1 anyway. They weren't going to pick at number 2 anyway. Okay, they were going to wind up moving down a few spots. So for me, at least in the first round, for me, you're probably selecting from the same pool of players. Now, we can talk about Arvell Reese, the edge guy from Ohio State. We can talk about, whichever guy you think is the first or second player who should come off the board after the quarterbacks, because I'm pretty sure that with Las Vegas and the Jets at 1 and 2, if Dante Moore declares, I'm pretty sure that Fernando Mendoza and Dante Moore are going 1 and 2. I think that's pretty much guaranteed. But where I wanted to go with this is I think the Giants are picking from the same pool of players. I think dropping from 1 to 5 doesn't really change who they're going to get in the first round, who they're going to target. The shame of it is that they won't get that draft haul. They won't add those picks unless they want to go and look at some of their veteran players like Kayvon Thibodeau and whoever else they might want to trade, whether we're talking about Dexter Lawrence, if they really wanted to go that far and try to collect draft picks by moving some veteran assets. But I think they're picking from the same players, so I don't think it's going to hurt them in round 1.
Yeah, and I would say there is no single obvious player that they probably should want to get at number 5. And so
that's That's the
you know,
truly weird. That's the truly weird part about this draft is
yeah,
there's nobody there that you just bang the table for and say he's the perfect guy for them to draft.
they could go for one of the two wide receivers, or there you go, safety. Excuse me. At number 5, a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Hang in there, Tony. Hang in there. Yeah, hang in there. You know, it's one of those things when you talk about safety, because I remember a few years ago when Kyle Hamilton, you know, who's now, you know, an all-pro safety with the Baltimore Ravens, was in the draft. And I think that was Joe Shane's first year when the Giants had 5 and 7. And I would have been perfectly happy if the Giants had taken Kyle Hamilton at number 7. But people were like, oh, you can't take a safety number 7. You can't do that. Plus, he didn't run a fast 40 and all that. You can't take him. Well, he's only an all-pro, and he's only a massive difference maker. And I don't care what you say about positional value. He's only a better player than either one of the two guys that the Giants did draft in the top 10.
Yeah. Yeah.
Look, and the Giants need all the defensive help they can get. If Caleb Downs is sitting there at number 5 and you think he's the best player on the board, I don't care what position he plays. Take the kid.
Yeah.
Take the kid, because you need defensive difference makers. And if you think that's what he is, then don't pass him up for a guy who is going to be your wide receiver 2.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind wide receiver 2, but I think I'd be okay with Downs too. Downs was the best defensive player on the team, I thought, for Ohio State against Miami.
And I haven't studied these guys in depth, but I understand I understand why people like Arvell Reese, the linebacker / edge from Ohio State, and Reuben Bain, you know, the edge from Miami as well. The problem is you have Abdul Carter. You know, Arvell Reese is this year's Abdul Carter, and you just drafted Abdul Carter. And you've got Brian Burns, and you still have Kayvon Thibodeau. And even if you trade Thibodeau and you draft Arvell Reese, you have the same problem that you had this year, is fitting 3 players, fitting 3 players into 2 spots.
Yeah, and I would say you're better off trying to trade down if somebody's interested in someone where you draft. Take someone like, say, Sonny Styles later in round 1.
Sure. From a team building perspective, you know, Arvell Reese, Reuben Bain don't make sense. So I think you take them out of the discussion, and you look at the wide receivers, you look at the safety, you look at the offensive tackles, and it's interesting while we're talking about the draft, because I was sitting at the game today, and I wrote recently that I would really like to see the Giants bring back all 3 of their big free agents, and that being Wan'Dale Robinson, who I think is a must sign, absolute must sign, simply because you have to give Jackson Dart weapons, and you can't watch him go somewhere else. Cordale Flott to me is a must sign, because you don't want to create another hole, and you don't want to have to rely on Deonte Banks. And I look at Jermaine Illuminor, and for me, he's in, I would like to sign him, but if I can't bring back all 3, I have Marcus Bowe. You know, and I also think that Jermaine Illuminor played the best football he's ever played this past year. And he's good, but he's not great. And you also have 2 offensive tackles who might be top 10 worthy, you know, in the draft class. So if you look at those 3 guys, for me, maybe it's Illuminor that you move on from, you know, if you really want to draft one of those offensive tackles.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you do move on from Illuminor, which they'll know by the time of the draft, then you have no choice but to take a tackle. And I guess the guy from Miami, right, is what's his
There's
name?
I don't even know how to pronounce it. I will have to learn. I will have to
Begins with an
learn.
F, I think. Yeah,
Spencer Fano, I
but
think,
he
is who
looks
you're
he
talking
looks
about. Oh, I was thinking about the other one, Muaga,
oh,
whatever is.
yeah,
But I have
yeah,
to learn
yeah.
how to pronounce his name. But yeah, so that'll be interesting. I do think it would be really nice if the Giants had a couple of extra picks to to make some additional moves and all of that. And I do wonder, I got asked over and over and over during the past season about the Giants trading Kayvon Thibodeau. And my stance was always, I don't want to do it before the 2025 season. I don't even want to do it during the 2025 season. I want to let this play out and see how it works out with,
Mhm.
with the three guys, with Thibodeau, Carter, and Burns. I think now you're going to be bringing in a new head coach. You're probably bringing in a new defensive coordinator. No offense to Charlie Bullen, but I think the new head coach is going to want his own defensive coordinator. And I'd be surprised if it's Charlie, even though Charlie's done a good job since taking over for Shane Bowen. I just think now you might look at Kayvon Thibodeau the way you've seen Abdul Carter play the last few weeks. You might look at Kayvon Thibodeau as an asset you could move to get a couple of other picks. I think,
Yeah,
I think this offseason might be the time to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and I think what you've seen in these last few weeks, you've seen the defense play better, and so Charlie Bullen, I think accomplished something, and
Yes.
obviously you can't completely overhaul a defense when you're just brought in mid-season, right? But I think he did a reasonable job. I think he made it a more aggressive defense and a more problematic defense for opposing offenses, and you know the it's easy to say, the old Bill Parcells line, "You are what your record says you are." But the Giants finished second in points scored in the NFC East and second in points allowed in the NFC East at the end of this season, and so they are not far from the teams that they're competing against. They still have a ways to go, I think, to match Philadelphia, but Dallas and Washington, they're up there. And again, and we all know, right? They blew 5 fourth quarter leads this season. I was watching the end of the Denver Chargers game this season, where Denver won yet again to be like the number one seed in the AFC. And every time I see Denver on TV, I'm saying the Giants were up on these guys 19-0 late in the game. And I'm looking at all of these playoff teams. I'm looking at Green Bay, and I'm looking at Chicago, and so on. And the Giants were ahead of all of these teams. And there's every reason to think that the Giants could have been 7-10, 8-9 this season if they had a more aggressive defense. And it's not to say they don't need pieces. They do. I think their linebacking core is weak, and I think their secondary is at best mediocre. So they do need pieces. But as you say, the pass rush, they've got the pieces on the pass rush, and yeah, I feel like they're not that far from being a representative team. A Super Bowl winner, no,
Right.
that's elite, but
No.
but a much more representative team. They're not that far away. They've got players, and of course, the good part about that is, I think because of that, they will be able to lure attractive head coaching candidates who won't necessarily look at that roster and say, I've got to just blow this thing up and start from scratch.
Right. And that sort of leads to the next thing I think we need to talk about, and that is the future of general manager Joe Schoen. And I wrote Sunday morning that, for me, after a lot of consideration and with full understanding of all of the mistakes that Joe Schoen has made in 4 years, okay? All of the, that there's too many highly drafted players who didn't turn out to be what they were supposed to be. Um, there's You look at the free agent signings, and there really isn't. Maybe maybe you consider Illuminor a hit, as a 2-year contract, but there's not a lot of hits. The Brian Burns trade is a hit, okay, but there's a lot of free agency that's been kind of, meh, kind of, guys that just didn't do what you hoped they would do, and there's been too many
Mhm.
good players who have gotten away from the Giants. There's a lot of things you can look at with Joe Schoen and say that shouldn't have happened. Why did somebody not put their foot down and say no? I mean, you can go all the way back to, the more I learn about the situation, the more I realize that something that I always thought. Brian Dable was Joe Schoen's hire. I believe with all my heart that Brian Flores was the guy that John Mara would have preferred to hire in 2022. I think that it was the Mara family and Tim McDonald. I think it was Giants ownership that really pushed to make sure that Brian Flores even got an interview
Mhm.
for the job. And I think that had John Mara been making that decision, that Brian Flores would have been the head coach instead of Brian Dable. But he didn't want to step on Joe Schoen when he had just hired the guy. So he let
Right.
Joe Schoen make the decision to hire Dable. But that all, I bring that up because people say, well, why can't you go to Brian Flores now? There's just too much water under the bridge. There's just too much with the lawsuit and with all the things that were said and everything else. I just don't think that fence can be mended to the point where
Yeah.
you can make Brian Flores the head coach. But my point this morning was, if you believe that the New York Giants are, as you and I talked about, a team that should have won 7-8 games this year, that are that are close to being, a competitive team that could be that could be fighting for a playoff spot in the last week or two, then you shouldn't want the Giants to fire Joe Schoen, in my view. Because if you fire the general manager, what you get is a teardown of the roster, of the front office, of the scouting staff. You get a teardown of everything that leads to probably a couple more 2 to 3 to 4 win seasons before you start to see progress. If you think you're that close, you should want the general manager to stay, and you should want the Giants to do whatever they can to get the right head coach. And there's no guarantee you get the right coach, but you should be crossing your fingers that they get the right head coach to match with Joe Schoen and go from there. That's my thought.
Yeah, and so I'm okay with them sticking with Joe Schoen, but I do think Joe Schoen has some things to answer for, and so
Mhm.
if I am Giants ownership, I'm asking him point blank, what did you do wrong that put us in this situation? Because it's partly a personnel situation. They may have gotten the head coach wrong, although I thought Brian Dable was a good hire at the time it
Mhm.
was done. Okay, but the fact is he's made mistakes in assembling the roster, and I'd like a stark answer from him about what are you going to change? What did you not do over these past few years that is going to be different in the future? And I mean, I harp on this a lot whenever I have a chance to think about it, but my feeling about Joe Schoen is that he is content to leave holes on the roster because he is so concerned with staying under the cap and not accumulating void year money or option bonus things or any of the other tricks that other GMs use. And the problem is that he's bringing a knife to a gunfight when he's competing with other general managers who use those tools available to them. And so he lets the Giants go into the season with a mediocre at best linebacking core. I would say a subpar, linebacker core. For several years, he let them go into the season with a subpar offensive line. This year, beyond Malik Neighbors, he let them go into the season with a subpar wide receiver core. And then at the trading deadline, when other teams were trading for receivers who were there to be had, Schoen was staying put, not doing anything to beef up the team. And so I feel like there's something about his general philosophy of how he does things that is anchored in a time in the past when quote unquote fiscal responsibility was the name of the game. But now in the NFL, fiscal responsibility is frankly passé. And I feel like you have to say, what are you going to do to make sure that we don't have a position group that's a real weakness that is causing us to lose games? And I don't know what his answer would be if you posed that question to him, but I'd want to hear the answer to that before I agreed to let him be the guy run the team next year.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, Tony. I think, and I think those are conversations that he would have with ownership and questions he should be asked. He's not going to share those with the media, obviously, but I do think they should ask him hard questions. And I do think he gets a lot of credit for his cap management, and I'm not sure his cap management is as good as people want to believe that it is, or as good as he would like you to believe that it is. One of my issues with Joe is if as you say, you're leaving all of these holes on the roster, okay, in an effort to clean up the cap, in an effort to put the Giants in a healthier cap situation, then how, over the last 2 seasons when you've won 7 games, how is it that at the start of both of those seasons you have bled the cap down to the nub, to the point where you are one of the teams with the least amount of cap space, and you are using all sorts of tricks and all sorts of restructures and playing games with leaving a couple of, going into a couple of games here and there with 51-man rosters instead of 53-man rosters to save a few nickels, against the cap. If you're leaving all of these holes on the roster, how are you managing to bleed the salary cap down to almost nothing at the start of the season if you're not building a complete roster? So that's one of the questions I would have for him when it comes to cap management is if you're spending every penny, which you basically are, if you're spending every penny we're allowed to spend, how is it that we still have positions that don't have good players? And that would be one of my questions for Joe as well. But I do think where the Giants are, if you get this coaching hire right, and God only knows the Giants haven't gotten a coaching hire right since Tom Coughlin. Okay. We know that they haven't gotten it right since Tom Coughlin, and it's not easy to get it right. It's not easy. Teams get it wrong more often than they get it right. But if they get this right, it can work. And that leads me to the head coaching search, Tony. And, we've been watching every headline and every tweet and all of that comes out to figure out if the Browns are going to fire Kevin Stefanski, or are the Ravens going to lose tonight so that Baltimore fires John Harbaugh, or who are the Giants going to hire? who's going to get an interview, and and God forbid, I don't want to see the backlash on the website when the Giants bring in Mike McCarthy for an interview. Because I can see it now. I'm just going to need to turn the comments off. That's just a fact. That's just how it's going to be. I'm just going to need to turn the comments off. But when push comes to shove, if you're matching somebody with Joe Schoen, what's your wish list? Who do you really want?
So I'm open to the idea of either a head coach with previous NFL experience or a first time NFL head coach, but that only goes so far. And I guess my question is, for any candidate, why would you want to go with this particular guy? And so, if you hire someone with like Mike McCarthy, you mentioned, right? Okay. Mike McCarthy's been around forever. He won a Super Bowl once a long time ago with Aaron Rodgers. He doesn't excite me at all. I want to know, what is he going to do for the team that that they don't already have? When I look at some of the teams in the league that I envy, then I see teams like Seattle. I don't think there's anything wrong with a first-time head coach. So Seattle hired Mike Macdonald, and Mike Macdonald had a kind of rough first season. He lost to the Giants in his first season, one of the few games they won. It was the Giants' best game of the season in Seattle, that they beat Mike Macdonald. But boy, 1 year later, Mike Macdonald is looking like an awfully good head coach. I mean, that team is certainly got to be considered one of the favorites to win it all this year, and he's built a tremendous defense, and a certainly good enough offense in a very short period of time. I can think of other, great examples of first-time head coaches who've been very successful. The obvious one is Sean McVay, who some people would say is the best head coach in the NFL, right? And he was a first-time head coach, right? And so you can do it with new guys if they're the right new guys, and then the question becomes, what does one of those guys bring to the table in terms of a philosophy of how they're going to win, and that's something I would want to know if they're going to interview a Jeff Hafley, let's say, or someone of that ilk, or a Chris Shula, right? That's another name out there that's hot. But I'm fine with that type of coach as long as you see the vision for what it is they want to do and you allow them to execute the vision. I can also see them going with an experienced head coach, and so if John Harbaugh popped free from Baltimore, you can argue with John Harbaugh because it's been over a decade since he won a Super Bowl there in Baltimore, but John Harbaugh has had that team in the playoffs almost every season since he's been there. He's won it all once, and he's been in the mix for a Super Bowl the rest of the time. I'd jump on him in a minute among experienced head coaches if I could get him. The kind of interesting one to me that I don't know how to feel about is Kevin Stefanski, because Kevin Stefanski was a little bit of a golden boy early in his career as Browns head coach, and then the Browns, of course, have fallen on really hard times since then. But the other thing that I think we all kind of know about the Browns from the outside is that it's one of the most dysfunctional organizations out there. It has a reputation for the owners meddling extensively in what's going on, and maybe we saw that with the whole quarterback situation in this past season. And so it's kind of hard to get a read on how good Kevin Stefanski is and what he would be if placed in a different situation. But I'd at least be willing to consider that. So I'm trying to be open-minded about who they hire as a head coach. I just want it to be someone that makes me say, "Oh, that's intriguing," and makes me think of some way in which I think he'll probably make the team better.
Yeah, the only thing I worry about with the first-time head coach is the whole idea of learning on the job. And if you had an organization that was used to winning, okay, and had established a winning culture and had a long-time GM with a track record who could guide a young coach, I would feel better about it. I would feel better about hiring a first-time head coach. And you can get it right with a first-time head coach. You absolutely can. I just look at the Giants and I look at all the layers of their front office, and I look at the fact that Joe Schoen is the GM, but there's so many voices in that front office. There's people in that front office that have been there for 25 years. There's family members there's Mara family members in that front office who, like it or not, have a voice. They have an opinion that matters because they're Mara family members.
Yep.
So Joe Schoen does not have carte blanche to do whatever Joe Schoen wants. There's a lot of layers to decisions that get made. And plus, it's dual family ownership, which no other franchise in the NFL has. And I just look at an experienced coach who's dealt with an owner before. And maybe for me, that's one of the appeals of Stefanski. I think Stefanski's a terrific coach, handicapped by a dysfunctional franchise. And I think he's used to I think he understands how to navigate that. Not that the Giants are dysfunctional in the way that the Browns are dysfunctional, but because of all the layers, you have to have a strong voice. You have to know what you want. You have to know how to articulate it, and you have to be able to fight for it. And to me, that's kind of why at this point in time, I would like an experienced head coach. By the way, as we're going along here, the Atlanta Falcons have fired both head coach Raheem Morris and general manager Terry Fontenot. So
that news broken by a big scam there in the comments.
Yeah, big, but but it's also flashing by on Twitter as well. So
yeah,
but
back to this idea of the type of head coach, and again, I think it can go either way. It depends on the guy, and it also depends on how much power he has within the organization. So one of the most interesting coaching change stories that occurred during the past season was Jacksonville, right? Where Jacksonville wanted to hire Liam Cohen, and Liam Cohen said, "I'll come, but not if Trent Baalke is still the GM." And so he actually apparently, agitated for Jacksonville to replace its general manager and put somebody in that he felt he could work with. That would be a very interesting thing if there's some kind of hot candidate for head coach who really impresses the Giants in interviews, and then he says, "But I don't know if I can work with Joe Schoen." And
I do think oh, go ahead, Tony. I'm sorry.
I was gonna say, or I can work with Joe Schoen, but only if Joe Schoen is willing to do these things that I want done.
Well, see, that's the interesting scenario, because the Giants have always been an organization that had a certain structure. The GM has always been at the top of that structure. And look, because of all of the layers in the organization, I don't consider Joe Schoen to be what you would call a strong GM to the point where his word rules. Okay. Dave Gettleman wasn't that way. I'm not sure Jerry Reese was ever that way. There's just so many layers to the decision-making process with the Giants that I don't think you can say, this is my decision, I'm making it, you're all just going to have to get on board, and I don't care what the rest of you think, this is what we're doing. you guys just go do the jobs you're paid to do, and let me do the job I'm paid to do. That's not how it works with the Giants. But I do wonder if, let's use John Harbaugh as an example. John Harbaugh's got 18 years of experience. He's been in the playoffs a dozen times. If John Harbaugh says, "Yeah, I'd love the job, but I also want personnel control." That's something the Giants have never given a head coach. They didn't give it to Tom Coughlin. They didn't give it to Bill Parcells. Would they give personnel control to a John Harbaugh or a Mike Tomlin or a Kevin Stefanski to the point where that head coach could say, "This is the person we're drafting in the first round. These are the free agents that I would really like for us to chase. I'm going to be the person who makes the final decision on who's on our 53-man roster." Would they give that kind of control to a head coach? I don't know. Would they put them, would they go along with, if they really wanted John Harbaugh and he says, "I want to bring my own GM," would they do that? We'll have to see. So, but it's interesting. Go ahead, Tony.
I was going to say, but if you hire a prominent coach, let's say like a John Harbaugh is not going to come in without some promise of some level of control over
Absolutely.
things. He's not going to come in and say, "I'm going to slot in underneath Joe Schoen." He's going to say, "What's Joe Schoen ever done? I'll tell you what I've done. I've won a Super Bowl, and I've brought my team to the playoffs almost every year and made them a Super Bowl contender. And so don't tell me I'm going to answer to Joe Schoen," right? And so there are coaches who have enough stature to demand, not complete control, but some level of control. And I would say a minimum level of control. And and I would say this regardless of who the head coach is. But I would say if I'm interviewing for the head coach position, then one of my questions to Joe Schoen, going back to something he said at the beginning, is, "This is the linebacker core you're going to give me?" Right? And a couple of other questions, like that. And so I really do feel that if they want to make progress, they have to be not so hierarchical about how they envision things themselves, and be willing to take on a head coach with enough stature, whether stature because of previous success like John Harbaugh, or stature because they are kind of the latest kind of hot candidate, like a Clint Kubiak, let's say, or or something like that, or the next Sean McVay, or whatever, right? But either way, someone where the head coach does have some influence over what the GM does, and the GM feels some necessity to get the head coach what he thinks that he needs, regardless what the GM himself may think about that.
Yeah, absolutely, Tony. It's all going to be a very, very interesting offseason, and we will see how it unfolds. And the first thing we're going to find out, probably sooner rather than later. And if I know the Giants, we won't know until tomorrow for certain. But the first thing we'll find out is whether or not Joe Schoen is actually going to stay. And I mean, it certainly looks like that's going to be the case. And probably later in the week, we'll start to hear some word about head coaching interview candidates, and we go from there. But believe it or not, we are in off-season mode already.
It's hard for me to actually take that in, because the season just goes so fast. I feel like it wasn't that long ago that we were sitting here talking about how many games we thought the Giants might win this season at the beginning, and worrying about their horrendous schedule,
And
which turned out to be mostly true, right? By the
and
way, I mean, I think we didn't know
mhm.
how true it was going to turn out to be. There were some teams that we had no idea would be that good, like Denver, and other teams that turned out a lot worse than expected, like Washington. Mostly I
No,
think
but
due to
but you
schedule.
knew. I mean, you knew that it would be hard. You just didn't know how hard. But Tony, I'm pulling rank this year when they release the. I know they've released the opponents, and we posted that at Big Blue View today already. And it's not easy. It's not easy, but we'll find out what the actual schedule looks like, in a couple of months in terms of times and dates and all of that. But we're off and running into the off season, and that starts tomorrow when we find out about Joe Schoen, and we go from there. So Tony, I think that's a good place for us to call it a day.
Mhm.
And thank you very, very much. And Giants fans, thank you for watching as we put together an evening show for you. So thanks again. Stay safe out there. Take care of each other, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.